Morning everyone. My name's Julian Hartley. I'm the Managing Director of the new NHS Improvement Body, which is new. It brings together all of the previous organisations and initiatives involved in improvement in the NHS. Before I took up this job in October, I've been Chief Executive of 3 different healthcare organisations in the Northwest, Primary Care Trust and 2 foundation trusts. But before I start, I can't resist but take up the baton from Mike about the most difficult ever speech or presentation that you've done, because I remember back in many years ago in the northeast of England, and those of you that know the northeast might know the towns of Stockton and Hartlepool. I worked at a trust up there. I was the Chief Operating Officer responsible for leading a major reconfiguration programme between the 2 towns, and I had to go and explain to a group of councillors in Stockton why services were changing at the hospital. We were moving certain services from Stockton to Hartlepool and others from Hartlepool to Stockton. I was armed with all the evidence. I had my arguments honed to a T. They were all on a fantastic PowerPoint presentation. Phoned the hotel in advance, said, "Have you got PowerPoint?" "Oh yes, we got PowerPoint." Absolutely, no problem. Arrived at the hotel, a room not dissimilar to this, walked up with my disc and said to the chap in charge, "Where's the PowerPoint?" He pointed to the socket in the wall and said, "It's there." So you won't be seeing any PowerPoint this morning. I learnt my lesson. I want to start with a question to all of you, just to give me a sense of the kind of where you're at. Just put your hand up if you are leading or involved in a major change programme right now. Okay, good. That's probably about 3/4 of you, which it should really be all of you given you're here. But just of those of you that have put your hand up if that programme is about or includes an effort to reduce cost. Yeah, okay. And put your hand up again if it's also about improving quality. Okay. So similar number of hands for both quality and cost. And I think one of the binds that we've found ourselves in, certainly with the narrative that Mike was talking about, is that somehow these are mutually exclusive, where of course what we're about today, hopefully, is understanding how these 2 things come together, how we can be more efficient and productive, and how we can raise the bar on quality of services to patients, to the public, to customers. If I reflect on my time leading NHS organisations, one of the big challenges has been how to tackle what has been regular pressure on finances. It's absolutely critical right now, given the state of the economy and given the pressure on public services, but it has always been there. Even at the times when the NHS was enjoying record growth, there were still many organisations that were under a lot of financial pressure and having to deliver significant cost improvement programmes. And I think that when you look at the Mid-Staff's report, you can see that some of the pressures there about delivering against financial targets drove the organisation into places that were inappropriate. And I think it's important that when we reflect on our experiences of leading major change in relation to cost reduction programmes, that probably the experience that all of us have had of those have been the most successful ones are where we've been able to create a proposition that isn't just about the finance director's requirement to reduce costs by 7% in that year, but have been about a more transformational approach to deliver a much better service with, absolutely, a key driver to reduce cost, but setting the proposition in a way that is much more about framing that as an improvement in quality and an improvement in service and a redesign approach. And of course, I'm sure many of you in the audience have had experience of using particular methodologies, whether that's lean or business process re-engineering or whatever else in relation to that. And we've learnt a lot. And there is an evidence base behind a lot of this. And I'll say a bit more about that because I think that's important. But I think increasingly, as certainly in my experience, as we've moved through the years, where before it's always been the natural tendency to manage your cost improvement work within the boundaries of your own organisation, to go to back office functions, to keep going back to support services for more CIP, to look at your staffing levels, your skill mix, all of the things that organisations do. Those have generally been contained within organisations. And even our whole strategy around the development of foundation trusts has been to create entities that can stand on their own 2 feet and deliver a business proposition and a care proposition that is self-contained and that delivers. Now we know that healthcare is massively interconnected, and no single organisation can just pull up the drawbridge and do its own thing. And I think that's increasingly the case now. I think about the challenge of the cost reduction programmes that I've been faced with in the latter years of running a big FT, and it becomes very apparent that it wasn't within our ability to do this within the walls of our organisation. There had to be an engagement with the wider system to redesign services. And that becomes challenging because you're having to create a set of partnerships, a shared mission and purpose amongst a whole set of stakeholders, all of whom may have multiple bottom lines and different agendas. But I suspect that is what's going to define success for us over the coming years, is how good we are at being able to make those connections across healthcare systems and economies to really drive out cost and improve quality and deal with some of the fundamental issues about care delivery. And that, if you like, you could describe that as large-scale change. It's change that's on a much broader footprint. It's change that requires a much more networked approach, and it requires arguably a different style of leadership to the one that's driven the more focused, organisation-centric approaches to cost reduction and delivery of key targets. I think what's also interesting about the narrative that's unfolded since Mid-Staffs is that somehow targets are bad. You know, that the targets around, for example, A&E 4 hours, 18 weeks, that somehow those have driven inappropriate behaviours. But let's remember, there were good reasons why those targets were set up in the first place. When I joined the NHS, patients were waiting over 2 years to have heart transplants. Patients were dying while waiting. We're now at a stage where patients wait no longer than 18 weeks for the same operation. That is progress. And that's about quality of care and improving mortality and morbidity for patients. So targets have a role and targets have a purpose, but I think it's how we define those targets that matter. So when we're talking about A&E, when we define our shared purpose solely in terms of we've got to meet the 4-hour target, that's too narrow. We need to define ourselves in creating the best possible urgent care system for that community. And I'm sure that most organisations are thinking more holistically in that respect, but I think our efforts around change and how we approach change need recalibrating in a number of ways. Now, if we're being asked to deliver large-scale change, there's a major challenge there, because large-scale change is difficult, takes time, and isn't always successful. There's been a really interesting review done very recently by York Health Economic Consortium about energy for change and about large-scale change. And just to give you a few pointers from that, when we look at the history of large-scale change efforts, the most common reason that leaders fail to achieve the goals is simply because they run out of energy and they simply fizzle out. Now, that might sound odd, but I recognise that. The number of times we've all sat in a room of stakeholders together and made commitments to changing the system and doing things differently, and then people go away into their own organisations and other priorities overtake those. And we've never, arguably really gripped the ability to make that level of whole-scale system change that is required. On the other hand, leaders who tap into the positive energy for change that exists amongst their people and unleash it for the benefit of achieving organisational goals, shared organisational goals, typically get better outcomes. And so it follows that in an era of cost improvement and quality improvement, the ability to maintain and develop that energy for change across large-scale systems in order to deliver those transformational ambitions for communities and patients is absolutely central. Now, it's really easy to say that. Oh, yeah, fine, yeah, agree with that. So how do we do it? And what evidence is there to help us navigate our way through that? Well, I guess the first thing to say is that the NHS has done a lot of work on what works and what underpins the key success factors for large-scale change and transformation. And it comes down to seven key areas, and I'll just run you through those. 7 key areas that surround, right in the middle, what we describe as our shared purpose. And I suppose I'd challenge you when those of you that put your hand up to say you're involved in a major change programme, is everyone in that programme, including all of the stakeholders that don't necessarily reside in your own organisation, really clear about the shared purpose of that? And is that defined in terms of benefit for patients, communities, customers? Because defining a shared purpose, first and foremost, is arguably where people need to be to start with. But then surrounding that, there's 7 key factors. And just taking those in turn. Leadership for change. Do all our leaders have the skills to create transformational change? Some really interesting work on leadership in relation to change. The NHS, arguably, has delivered quite a top-down approach in the past. There's been a heavy emphasis on pace setting. The research from the NHS Leadership Academy shows that the pace setting behaviour is the most dominant amongst NHS senior leaders. In other words, come on, move it on, hit the milestones, let's get some pace into this, let's move this forward. But other dimensions of leadership have been more neglected. And those are the ones that are really a premium right now in terms of achieving a sense of cohesion and collaboration. The other thing I think that's so that number 1, leadership for change. Number 2, engagement to mobilise. And when we talk about engagement, we're talking about, are we engaging and mobilising all the right people, particularly our frontline staff? Now, engagement of staff isn't just an NHS issue, it's a UK issue. And some really interesting evidence about the UK-wide picture on engagement. And the UK, arguably, has an employee engagement deficit. Survey after survey indicates that around only 1/3 of UK workers say they're engaged, a figure which leaves us ranked 9th for engagement levels amongst the world's 12th largest economies as ranked by GDP. That's not a good place to be, and there is a huge issue around that. And if that weren't bad enough, we also have a productivity deficit as a UK economy. The most recent ONS survey found that the output per hour in the UK was 15 percentage points below the average for the rest of the G7 industrialised nations in 2007. So we have an engagement issue and we have a productivity issue. And arguably the two come together in terms of much evidence that is out there, and if you've not seen it, I'd encourage you to look at the McLeod report on employee engagement. Employee engagement, the business case for that is overwhelming in terms of driving greater productivity and discretionary effort. And so in the NHS, when you look at the results of the last staff survey that NHS employers summarised, it's no surprise to see that the staff engagement index fell last year, and the results showed that fewer staff felt able to make suggestions for improvement, and less than a third reported that senior managers act on feedback from staff. So you put those things together and we have some challenges. And we need to think about how we adopt and adapt our approach to large-scale change and to engagement if we're going to deliver. So, number 2, engagement to mobilise. Number 3, spread of innovation. Are we designing for the active spread of innovation from the start? There are some great examples of innovation in the NHS, but do we spread them? Do we diffuse them? Do we learn from one another? No. The evidence is that we don't. And we need to do that, and we need to find means and ways of ensuring we do that. Fourthly, forget where I'm up to, but improvement methodology. Every change programme, whatever it is, whether you're using Deming or Lean or Six Sigma or whatever your approach, you need a philosophy, you need an approach in terms of a methodology to drive the change, to ensure that you're clear about how you're going to approach that. So part of the role of the new improvement body will be to support organisations with their improvement work and their methodologies. Rigorous delivery. Do we have an effective approach for delivery of change and monitoring of progress towards our planned objectives? We're pretty good at this. I think generally rigorous delivery is what the NHS does quite well, but it sometimes misses the mark in terms of some of the other components. Transparent measurement. Are we measuring the outcome of the change continuously and transparently? And I think this is going to become a really big deal. It is already a big deal. News today about hospital in relation to mortality rates. Public are interested in what goes on in hospitals. How can we demonstrate transparent measurement for other parts of the health sector, including primary care and community services, that arguably haven't had specific measures that people can relate to? How do we create a set of metrics that people understand and are able to judge us on? Bruce Keogh set the challenge down for consultants, all consultants, not just heart surgeons, to put out their mortality rates and their clinical effectiveness measures so that the public can see at a glance where we're at. That's going to be a big part of how we approach large-scale change programmes. System drivers. Are our processes, incentives and systems aligned to enable change? This is, I think, this is an issue for policymakers. So when we approach large-scale change challenges, many of them involve really tough decisions. They involve politicians getting cross about services being moved from their local economies. Mike's said some very, very important stuff publicly about the importance of politicians getting behind really, really strong cases for clinical change. And there's been some important work done in a number of economies about how do you galvanise momentum and support for difficult decisions that need to be made around change. But we also need to look at some more technical things like payment by results and so on, and how we make sure that we shift the balance to enable the revised models of care that we want to present, particularly in relation to urgent care, where we cannot sustain the volume of urgent care patients going into hospitals. And we need to think about a really, really clear separation around elective, emergency, and how we manage those things most effectively on a 7-day basis. So, time. So, sorry, I'm being shooed off. So that model I've described is the NHS change model. And I would recommend it to you. It has got a website, www.nhschangemodel. And as a new improvement body, we will be supporting that and supporting organisations roll that out. So I will stop there. Thank you for listening and look forward to meeting more of you during the day. Thank you.